So the second thing we wanted to talk about are what an amazing year, and congratulations to each and every one of you in a school for making it through, because has there ever been a year more challenging? Certainly not in my lifetime for schools than what happened this year. So we wanted to talk about a couple of features that we were looking at this year that we thought were particularly interesting. And to that end, we're going to split into two sessions, and you can pick them at any point now. And I will say what I said with Brian, especially with Gwyneth. If you go there, go with Gwyneth. I will not question your judgment at all. We're delighted to have Gwyneth Connell with us, who's the director of the Grauer Institute. Hey, Gwyneth, would you just take a moment and say what the Grauer Institute is at the Pomfret School?
Absolutely. So about 7 or 8 years ago, our head of school and board chair sort of put their heads together, and we're talking about what they wanted to, how they wanted Pomfret to distinguish itself from other schools. If you're familiar with boarding schools in the Northeast, it's like every school's got a thing. Like Tabor's got a boat, and Berkshire's got a mountain, and Millbrook's got a zoo. They've all got a thing. And so Pomfret said, what would happen if we just decided to do teaching and learning really, really well? And so the Grauer Institute is essentially, I think of it as if Pomfret School is the learning experience we create for students here on the Hilltop, the Grauer Institute is the learning experience we create for adults on behalf of kids. So it reflects our commitment to a growth mindset among our faculty that we want to model for our students. And it's a lot of fun to be at a school that really cares about this stuff and has really committed to it.
Great, thank you, Gwyneth. And I'm so delighted to have Jill Webb on this session for the many times that she said, so is that our thing? And the very rich discussions about what our thing at the Wellington School was or could be. And I'll be taking the other, and quite simply, we're going to talk about in this most disruptive year, has it changed? You know, do we go immediately back to business as usual, or do we embrace some of the positives that disruption brought to us? And so I'm looking for an interesting conversation there. COVID caused so many different kinds of things. We thought we'd put down a few of them here, but boy, oh boy, it just, how do you even talk about it? Well, you talk about it because we're school people, and so we're used to talking about stuff. But the extraordinary number of really significant changes that hit schools this year. One of the things we had wanted to do initially was to do some research into the remote versus the in-person education and collect data on that. And one of the things we found in the first couple of weeks of this year was you couldn't do it because there were so many different variations of what schools were doing. Some that were entirely remote, some that were entirely in person, some that were a combination, some that had some kids on Mondays and others on Tuesdays. And so it has just been a disruptive a feature, and quite striking to Brendan and to me that every time we talked to a school, it was different. There were really no two schools that managed this quite the same way, which we thought was really fascinating. So we did some, as we move forward, there are things we can learn, and that's one of the things we really are eager to talk about. Brendan?
Gotta find my unmute button. Yeah, so earlier this year, we did a study where we were looking at, we're trying to get to the effect that COVID-19 had on engagement in schools. So we decided to do a study where we would analyze the difference in engagement index data. Rob, you can move forward. The engagement index data for schools who had recorded engagement dots both in the fall of 2019, so before COVID, but also in the fall after in 2020. And then we were trying to compare just the data for those schools in just those two fall terms, because we were curious to know what happened. Were there different breakdowns among different divisions? Did math dots get affected more or less than other dots, for instance. So when we looked at all of this, we ended up having a sample of about 19 different schools, 9 of which were public, 4 were independent, and 4 were Christian schools in the ACSI. And they were spread across 10 different states. The percentage of dots we looked at stayed pretty steady. So about half of the dots were in public schools, and then about a quarter in independent and in the ACSI Christian schools, that then moved to about a third independent and 15% ACSI. So one of the interesting things we found was that overall, student engagement actually went up in the schools that we sampled from the fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020. So we see that engagement scores actually went up about 2.3 percentage points. Board numbers fell about 2 percentage points, and then we had about the same in entertained and a fall in grind by 2 points. So really interesting and sort of counterintuitive. We were surprised to find that engagement went up in that COVID year. And there's a couple reasons that we thought that might happen. Firstly, that students might have just missed being in school. And so, after that spring when everything was closed down, they found that it was really more engaging to be in school rather than not be in school. But also this sort of deeper idea that the unpredictability that students felt may have increased their engagement simply because they had to be on their toes more, they had to be paying attention more, they had to be ready for whatever was coming next and be constantly trying to figure out, how will I attend class? How will I get these projects done? When will I turn them in and where? And all sorts of the crazy things that happened in COVID. So this idea of unpredictability is something that we're wondering if we could implement into classrooms in a maybe more healthy way than through COVID in the future, and try to enhance engagement in this way. So Rob will be leading a breakout session about this idea of including more surprise in our classrooms as a way to enhance student engagement going forward, to see if we can get some nugget of positive learning out of this crazy year. And then our second section will be about this idea of supporting student autonomy in our schools. So this is kind of a crazy graph that we put together in that same session of analysis. And so we see here 3 different dumbbells, we call them. So on the far left, we have grades 3 and 4, the middle grades 5 through 8, and then on the far right, grades 9 through 12. Each dot shows the difference in student engagement between the 2019 school year and the 2020 school year, again in that fall term. So the teal dot is 2019 and the dark blue dot is 2020. And then we have split it up by gender. So we have male students and female students. So what we see here is that in the younger grades, engagement falls. So we have lower Lovett and lower challenge scores for both male and female students in grades 3 and 4. In grades 5 through 8, we have higher Lovett and lower challenge. And then in the high school students, we have higher Lovett and higher challenge. So it's a really interesting trend that we see happening in lower, middle, and upper school that sort of shifts for both male and female students over time. And so we were really interested to know, why is this happening in the first place? So our hypothesis was that it was a student autonomy issue. Our thought was that the COVID pandemic required students to be far more autonomous in taking care of the work they were doing, in getting their homework done and learning their lessons asynchronously, all these sorts of things. And that as students got older, they were more capable of taking on that autonomy. So for younger students, having additional autonomy may have been really challenging or difficult, or led to just being disengaged because they're not being taught in the way they know. But older students benefit from student autonomy because they want to be able to take more charge of their learning. So this was sort of the hypothesis. And so the thought we're having is, how can we better support student growth in this area in schools going forward? So Rob, you can move forward a few.
And
go ahead.
Just wanted to add, so our thought was that in lower school, students weren't particularly wanting autonomy and didn't know how to handle it.
Right.
In middle schools, students wanted autonomy, so higher Lovett, but didn't know how to use it, so lower challenge. And high school students perhaps wanted and we're able to use autonomy. So the big question moving forward has to do with this notion of autonomy, and how do we support that, which will be what Gwyneth is going to lead a discussion about, and we're really eager to have that. So we would like you in the chat to tell us which of these groups you'd like to pop into, and we're going to take a break now of, it is until 10:30, I think. So we'll break until 10:30 and then we'll be back with you. But before you take your break, please tell us which group you're going to join.
So
Gwyneth, before you start, I just have to apologize. I'm going to have to leave at 11.
Okay.
I don't want you to think I'm rude. I'm in my faculty reflection week that the school just ended, and
Gotcha.
I'm toggling between faculty meetings and this.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad you can be here with us for as long as you can.
Thanks.
So shall we just do some quick introductions? I'm not sure how many folks know one another. I'm Gwyneth Connell. I'm the director of the Grauer Institute at Pomfret School, as you heard, which is a small boarding school in northeastern Connecticut. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Peter Herzberg. I'm head of school at the Mead School, which is a very small, progressive day school, K-8 day school in Fairfield County, Connecticut. That's southwestern Connecticut. And I'm also working occasional partnership with Brendan and Rob in the WEC initiative. And I've been involved in that for a couple of years, and also do some consulting work with schools.
Cool. Connie?
Sorry, couldn't find the button. Connie Chambers, teaching and learning at Savannah Christian Prep in Savannah, Georgia, K-12, pre-K through 12, sorry.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Jill?
I'm Jill Webb, and I'm in Columbus, Ohio. I'm the Director of Professional Development for ISACS, which is our accrediting body for our schools over 15 states. And I'm just finishing up my tenure as head of the lower school at the Wellington School.
Wonderful. And Suzanne?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Gorman. I'm the associate head of school over the high school for St. Francis in Louisville, Kentucky, a small independent progressive preschool through 12th grade.
Wonderful. And we all know Brendan.
Everybody knows Brendan.
Well, I'm so excited to have this conversation with all of you. When I heard Rob and Brendan present about some of the findings from the COVID data, I was pretty blown away. We at Pomfret had seen our engagement dots stay pretty consistent across the 2 years. And I had come up with every reason in the book to explain it away. Our distance learners were not great about completing the WE for us. So we had incomplete data. Yeah, I just was like, that can't possibly be true that they're just as engaged as they were last year. So I was explaining it away. So when I heard that was actually true across all the high schools, sort of on the macro level, I was like, oh my gosh, I really need to understand this better. And I still have my notes, my sort of scribbledy notes from that experience. And and I don't know if you can see at the bottom that I wrote, okay, embrace disruption. And then I was like, scope and sequence for autonomy. Yeah, like I told Brendan and Rob, I was like, I want to leave right now and just go make a scope and sequence for autonomy. I think that's such an exciting idea. I think it's something that we talk about a lot in schools, that we're trying to help kids become independent. We want them to take more and more responsibility for their own learning. But how much of that happens is actually intentional and planned and scaffolded, and how much of it is just sort of by mistake. So I'm very curious to hear sort of what are some of the things that bring you to this conversation. What are you hoping that we'll talk about? And then I have a few prompts if there's a pause in the conversation. Feel free to jump right in or I can ask a more targeted question. I'm just sort of curious what's bringing you to this breakout room and this conversation.
I will go first.
Great, thank you.
I've found that our engagement numbers increased. And I wondered, is it because our teachers were just working their butts off and doing all of the extra, and the kids took to that? We were a little hybrid, but we were face-to-face for the most part with all of the rules and restrictions that came with that. But we did have a number of kids in and out, a number of teachers in and out, so things like that created a kind of a question mark. But our engagement scores went up, grind went down, everything else kind of stayed the same, if I remember correctly. Was it the teachers were working so hard? Was it the kids? Was it the fact that we had to pare down our curriculum a little bit? It wasn't so broad and we were digging deeper. Did the kids enjoy that better? And I think they did. But all of the things that I was putting my finger on, the reason I'm here is how do I continue that, I guess, is the question. And that's what I want all of you guys to tell me. Kidding. But those were the things that because there were so many variables that I thought were possibilities. How do I know what's true and how do I continue those things? I don't want to recreate what happened. So how do I pull out those things?
Great, thank you.
I'll go next, I guess. I'm interested in this beyond just COVID. We were open all year because we're small enough and have no space that we didn't have to be remote. So I'm wearing two hats. One is the we hat and the other is the school leader hat. And the gap between what students say they want in terms of creating autonomy for students, what they actually do is still very striking to me, including at my own school, my own progressive school, which preaches that a lot. So I just want to find out what the connection between these two things, if in the We project, Brendan and Rob have discovered that, autonomy, mobility, and personal relationships are three of the things that are conducive to more engagement. I love the idea of designing, how do you design autonomy so that it's just not kind of reactive or serendipitous, but it's actually, deliberate. That's what I'm interested in.
Thank you.
We only started this year, this spring actually, so I don't honestly really know what to make of our dots related to COVID or not related to COVID or anything yet, but as a progressive school, student autonomy is obviously something that we prize. So I thought I'd just show up and, listen in and see what I could glean from all of you.
All right.
I'm sort of curious.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can jump back to Connie, I'm curious about the idea of paring down the curriculum and seeing if that's a way to, to find ways of introducing more student autonomy. I guess I'm just curious, is the idea that there are core things to focus on that are most important, and we just found that it was better to double down on that than go broad, and there's just some things that maybe weren't as necessary to spend the time on? I guess I'm just curious about what that whole process is like. That's really interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
What else I think is interesting from our perspective, we are 3 years old up to grade 4, about 290 lower school kids. We were in school all year and we eliminated almost all of the things that we thought were hugely engaging, like all the field trips and guest speakers, and yet I think engagement was higher. So that's puzzling. And I think we did even fewer hands-on activities. We were worried about sharing materials at the beginning, and all of those are activities that we have always connected really closely with high engagement.
Interesting. So that's so interesting. I mean, I come at this so much from a high school perspective. And so it's great to see that we have so many folks here who are sort of working with the whole range of age groups. And so obviously, you know, scaffolding towards autonomy looks really different for a 3rd grader than it does for an 11th grader. So one thing I'm curious about, and I'm putting this in the chat as well, is how does your school already scaffold students toward greater autonomy? Like, are there ways that you are very intentional in getting kids to be more self-directed as they get older?
We're K-8, and I used to work in high schools all the time. I've got to miss high schools, but I also love the K-8 spectrum because so much happens there. There are three answers somewhat to the question. You know, part of it's this notion of play and the relation between learning and play, which is, you know, play is somewhat unstructured, but really important and often thought of as two separate things, you know, recess versus work. And I think, you know, we're trying to close that gap. The other thing is the schedule. Scaffolding and schedule is really crucial. If the schedule doesn't allow time for how you design autonomy, then, you know, you've put up such an impediment to the scaffolding to begin with that, you know, I don't think you're going to get very far. So we're really working on that. And then we've built in throughout, even in kindergarten, throughout the curriculum, these little what you might call mastery projects that kids move towards at various points, various times, with different kinds of guidance. And we found that those rituals are helpful. So those are the things we're working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a boarding school, I think a lot of our intentional work towards autonomy happens outside the academic day. It happens in how we structure study hall differently for our 9th graders as opposed to for our seniors. You know, our freshmen have to take 4 of the 6 courses they take are predetermined. Every freshman takes the same humanities, English, humanities, history, science, and art classes, and then world language and math are more differentiated. But as kids get older, they're able to drive their academic program a bit more, you know, in keeping with their passions and interests and talents. But a lot of that is not what's happening in the schedule, it's what's happening around the academic day.
Yeah, Peter, I'm interested, you had mentioned trying to close the gap between like recess and playtime and academic work. And I'm curious how you go about doing that, but then also how you connect that to autonomy in the school.
Well, if you look at what happens in play, it's very curiosity driven and somewhat spontaneous, right? And adaptable, right? You don't, you know, even if you have a plan for playtime for kids, it changes constantly and adults have to adapt to it. And you kind of are learning about where kids are naturally curious, right? And trying to follow that. So the question is, how do you inject that into the quote unquote more academic program? You know, how does that work? And we're having big discussions about that. Part of the reasons we are is because we're pretty broke as a school. Our enrollment has dropped and we're struggling to build it back up. So we don't have an after school program. Well, COVID eliminated that anyway. So we have a very limited after school program, we have an early learning center, which is totally different, but the K through 8. So all this that happens, when it has to happen during the day, right? We can't say, okay, well, we're going to cultivate autonomy in our program after school. you know?
Right, yeah.
So we're really forced to distinguish ourselves from other schools around us in Southwestern Connecticut, to decide what it is that we really do that's much more distinctive and radical than the schools around us.
Mhm.
And so that's why, Brendan, we're exploring this. But I think you take what you learn in play, you know, and in the study of that, and then see what happens in the curriculum and how that works, and then, you know, how do you evaluate how you're doing? WE is one tool for doing that, but it's one of many. I don't know if that quite answers.
Yeah. Mhm. Other thoughts on that? Or reactions? So another question I have is, and I mean, you've spoken to this a little bit, but what are some of the things that get in the way when we think about the goal being for our students to be self-directed, self-sufficient? I mean, at the high school level, I know that, you know, sometimes content gets in the way, being like, well, but they've got an awful lot of, you know, algebra 2 they need to learn this year. So we don't really have time to give them a lot of choice, or like, we really got to get through the Merchant of Venice. So, and we need everybody to do it at the same rate. And, you know, the essay is actually due a week from Friday. So, you know, so what shape so maybe autonomy takes the shape of, you can write your essay responding to one of these 3 essay questions. And so it's a version of choice, but a pretty limited version of choice. So, I mean, so that's what's going on, I think, at the high school level is content and the, and, you know, the need for a certain amount of rigor, and like, let's move at a certain clip and make sure kids are accomplishing X, Y, and Z and developing the following skills. So what happens at other stages of childhood, or at other high schools? What's stopping us from letting kids play their way towards greater understanding of their world all the way through?
I wonder if part of it is related to, like, I'm partly thinking about if we had the ability to let students choose what type of project they did to answer an assignment, like whether that's a presentation or a video or a paper or whatever. I wonder if part of the issue is just that would take a long time to grade correctly and fairly, you know, between a bunch of different students that all have different projects. I wonder if it somewhat ends up being a time thing.
Well, I think Gwyneth is partly right. That high school is different from other grades, and that the content demands of high school and college placement and so forth kind of get in the way. But I also think that there are some things in common. There's the issue of trust. One is trusting the students we have students with a very big range of learning styles, you know, here at my school. And so one is trust that they can really do that they're capable of autonomy, you know, in their own agency. The other is marketing, for lack of a better word, you know, fear that you know, parents will say, well, you know, we're really not paying tuition, you know, for people to give in to my child's curiosity instead of imposing a bunch of skills on them. They won't quite put it that way, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Marketing dimension. And the other is just tradition, how teachers were trained, how they need to be untrained. And that's important. Even in the most progressive schools, I find that classes are still surprisingly teacher-centered, because it's really hard to let go of you know, certain kind of training and your excess of enthusiasm, you know, for what you're doing. And those are 3 things that I think to answer your barrier question. Those are certainly 3 things to get in the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's the question Brendan raised of time is really important. I think too, if you've ever done, you know, project-based teaching and learning, or if you've done those sort of big inquiry driven things. The middle feels weird to a teacher, like you are not in control, right? So, you know, you start on the same day at the same point and you say, I am the teacher and I will explain to you how this project will unfold and what the goal is and where we're headed. And then you kind of know / hope that on the last day, there's going to be the performance-based assessment where they stand up in the auditorium and deliver this polished product or whatever it is. But in the middle, when they're working through it, it can feel really chaotic and out of control. And it is a different kind of pedagogy. And it takes a teacher who really knows that the chaos means they're doing it right and can diagnose the difference between productive, generative chaos and just no one actually knows what they're supposed to be doing chaos. Those are nuances that most people are not just born being able to suss out.
No, and you do have to slow down.
Yeah.
I think that the reality is that you have to slow the pace down.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing I think we do fairly successfully as a school, but that may be because we're small too. You know, you just have to slow down, and it's connected also to this notion of differentiation. You know, if you're going to really develop a curriculum where there's real autonomy, then you really have to take that notion seriously, which also means you have to slow down. And I think very few people really know how to do that.
Yeah, it was interesting to me looking at the dots that there was sort of this idea that lower school kids kind of struggled a little bit with the increased autonomy because they're little and they don't know how to log into Zoom by themselves. And middle schooler and then high schoolers were like, yes, I wanted all this autonomy and now I can do it and I feel competent and I feel great because of this. And then in middle school, I thought middle school was so interesting because it was like, yeah, they think they want autonomy, but they're not ready for it. And so, I find that interesting, sort of how we might, in those middle school years, start to help kids who are hungry for autonomy better understand what it means. It doesn't just mean do what you want, whenever you want, but how can we give them the skills to be ready for greater self-direction in their learning? So I'm looking at the clock here and I see that we've got about 30 seconds until we get the 60-second warning. So one thing I'd love to have everybody think about is just like, what's one thing that you think your school could do tomorrow to better equip your students at all levels or at one level? Just like what's one point in the trajectory of your students' experience where you think you, and as a school leader and your teachers as the deliverers of this experience, how could we better equip students for autonomy as a goal of their education?
All right.
More practice. Just do it more. Start small and build.
Find out what each is really interested in.
All right. Well, we got 10 seconds, so I guess we'll see y'all back in the
main room.
Thank
you all so much.
Thank you.
Okay, wait a second. Okay, wait. Pig suey. Wait. Oh boy. It's pig suey. What am I missing? I'm missing. Woo pig suey, or right? Woo pig suey. Have I ever told you about my time in Blavel?
You still have to work on that, honey. Blavel.
Can I tell them I probably can't tell them the one thing. No, I'm not gonna do that. So, hello, Ralph. You are joining me and our entire Arkansas contingent. So we're delighted to have us all here.
Great.
We are recording. So Ralph, by the end of the session, we're going to see how your Arkansas accent is. And I'm wondering, Ralph, would you introduce yourself to my friends here?
Sure.
Great.
I'm Ralph Marshall. I teach at and I'm the Dean of Faculty at St. Francis School, which is a small independent school in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm learning about WEI every moment that we're on this. So it's been a very enlightening session for me.
Well, great. Thanks, Ralph. And actually, our conversation for the moment is going to be a little less about the engagement index and a little bit more about trying to determine one of the lessons that we think comes out of this year of COVID data. And again, we were really quite fascinated about the data that showed that engagement increased a little bit in this COVID fall versus the fall prior to, which was without any suggestion of COVID. Nobody had ever heard of it, I think, in the fall of 2019. And we were trying to draw some hypotheses about what that was about. And in talking to a student who just said, hey, we're so sick and tired of being at home that even the prospect of going to school made school seem new again. Which, as we were trying to draw positives that we could draw forward, we really thought about this notion of disruption as a positive. So I'm going to take about 3 or 4 minutes and talk a little bit about where schools are today and what we think about it, and then just a conversation among us friends about the degree to which disruption is a positive that can be embraced, and why it is that schools generally have are so wedded to or so fearful of disruption, which I think centers largely around not driving faculty members crazy. And Ralph, let me just say this to fill you in on this East group. The East Initiative brings project-based learning to fix community problems to 260 schools in Arkansas.
Right at 260.
About 260 schools in Arkansas, and in and of itself.
In 4 states.
In 4 states, most in Arkansas, but also there's one in Pennsylvania, isn't there?
Yes.
And then Louisiana. And what's the 4th state?
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. And in and of itself, East, I think, represents a disruption in the day for kids, because it is a program that's entirely project-based, that is just very, very dissimilar to the other programs in schools. Fair to say?
Very student driven.
Absolutely. And there is no high stakes standardized testing for the work that you guys do, which is really interesting. So as we just look for, I just wanted to say there are things we've known about schools. Schools are systems, and they are systems that have often been focused on making the system run, which often is really good for students who need predictability in their lives, but also the system can defeat the primary purpose of education, which is to lead students into exciting realms in ways that they might not have anticipated in the first place. So I just wanted to gather a couple of thoughts that have been out there for years that I think we all know about and have been striking. I pulled the 2013 Gallup poll, which showed a diminishing level of engagement on the part of students over time. When the kids come to us in the first place, a much higher percentage of them are engaged than by the time they finish with us. Gallup shows that, and it's just one of many sources. I just pulled this notion of factory schools, which are designed to run in routines that make them manageable. And I don't want to dismiss the notion that manageability is unimportant. I also don't want to lose the notion, particularly with Carmen and Stan, whose occupation is teaching, that some level of predictability is really important. I don't want to undermine that notion. That's an important notion. But the factory school, as they're often been called, have been put into place for reasons other than student engagement, I think is fair to say. The Gates Foundation commented on this in their 2006 studies. I mean, this is thinking that's gone on for a long time. The only other tool we know of that actually purports to measure engagement is the HSSSE, which is developed in the University of Indiana, which is a long survey taken generally once. Some schools will do it twice, but and one of the key differences we find between the HSSSE and the work we do is that this work is much more about, I think, the connection of students to their schools, and does not dig into individual classrooms, teachers, or students. But again, the issue here is that over time, too often for our students, school becomes a system to be born rather than a continuing time of exciting discovery, which is one of the reasons why the work that East does is so interesting, because it really does lead students to kinds of discoveries that don't happen in some other parts of their day. I just mentioned the late Clayton Christensen and his work on technology, and the thing that I took away from that book primarily was how hard it is for schools to reform themselves because they are so bought into the status quo, and therefore technology that might be truly disruptive ends up being used. Computer screens become nothing more than electric slate boards. And then finally, I just thought, this is from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a piece by Zachary Jason that talks about what he found to be four really particular reasons why students get bored. And the one that I'm playing with right now is the second one. The novelty of school itself fades with each grade, which then leads us to this finding that that in this fall of COVID, even with all of the difficulties that it created, that it led to higher engagement, even with amongst, particularly in high school students, where we would see a more jaded, more kind of a more eroded attitude about school. And Carmen, you teach primarily younger children, so it'd be where we found that there was not a significant increase in engagement. And so we'd really be interested in thoughts you have around that age group as well. But this notion of what do we do in schools that allows for novelty to be with us on a fairly regular basis struck us as what we thought was a really interesting piece to consider. So having said that, thought about ways that schools can be disrupted in positive ways. And I just want to be very clear that I am not proposing that we should wish for pandemics in order to break up the day, but that one of the positive lessons might be that we learned some things about making school novel again. So just listed some of the ways in which we might positively disrupt school. And so having spent that 7 or 8 minutes talking to you about what we were seeing, I want to open the floor up and first off ask, how is it that we're actually disrupting school in regular ways that enhance student engagement? And I'll just start with, do you buy the notion that one of the things that harms student engagement is the predictability and repetitive nature of school? So I'll start there. Are we entirely off in this whole notion?
I agree with what you're saying. I think that predictability is a way to sort of lull both students and teachers into a monotonous approach to learning. I, for myself, I just would oftentimes on the fly break up the day with some unpredictable thing that I would throw into it, oftentimes spontaneously, so I think that, and I'm pleased to see that technology is only one of many disruptive possibilities you've listed, and I think the pandemic has taught us both the advantages and the opportunities technology can provide, but also the limits of its
Great. That's a great point.
and it's opportunity. Yeah.
Great point, Ralph. Thank you very much. Other thoughts? Do you buy the notion that some level of disruption adds to novelty and therefore engagement for students? Just start with that premise, and that there is a danger of schools being monotonous. Students essentially have the same job starting at 3 or 4 years old until they stop going to classes.
One of the things I noticed with my kids is the motivation that they had, the freedom they had at home did not meet the motivation they needed to have for school to be successful. And there's some great opportunities here that we can learn from. Zoom meetings work. We don't have a country to have a meeting anymore. We can do this in our living rooms. But at the same time, those students needed to understand they have responsibilities to work with. And that's where I'm having problems, is those kids that are lacking that motivation because of that freedom given to them that they can't control, and the parents are not enabling them, or who are enabling them to not be successful. Mm-hmm. One parent told me, my kid's just lazy. That's why he missed 47 days of school last semester. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's in 9th grade. Bucket of water gets him out of the bed. I don't know about you, but he's a 9th grader. Get him up. But,
so one of the things, Stan, is you're going to want to listen to the recap of the other group, which is how you build over time sense of autonomy in students, so that when they are left to their own devices, or when the control is different than when you're in a classroom,
right?
That students can be productive. And of course, we went through 2 phases of this remote learning thing. The first was emergency remote learning in March, 2000, with no preparation, or largely no preparation, and then this more prepared, or at least the notion that folks had time to figure some of this out over the summer and reopen in the fall with it. Carmen, you work with younger students. I'm wondering whether what we're talking about, this sense of monotony, is apparent in younger students, or are they too early in the process to have been tamed?
It is absolutely apparent in students. When I was talking to my kids about where they place their dots, they're consistently low in social studies, which I find, social studies interesting because they're learning about ancient Egyptians, and they're learning about, they're learning about all this fun stuff that I remember learning about, that I taught about, that I thought my students were engaged. And so I said, guys, what's up with social studies? Why don't you like, that's fun. They're like, no, it's not. We get these little magazines and we have to read it and then answer the questions. And I said, that's it. And they said, that's it. I said, so the teacher doesn't teach? And they said, never. That social studies is a fill-in, and all we do is read and answer the questions. So that monotony of that's what they're going to do. Yeah. Those social studies scores, man, they were low on my kids. Yeah. Same thing with science. I was like, science is fun because you do experiments. No, we don't. We read the chapter, we answer the questions. Yeah. So that, I think absolutely that engagement totally tanks with the monotony of, we know this is what we're going to have to do. we might as well, we don't enjoy it. It's not fun. It's not engaging. It's just, we just have to do it.
And in part spurred on by high stakes standardized testing.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that Ralph, I'm sorry, what do you teach, Ralph?
I teach a class called Culture and Civilization, which is for freshmen. It's mainly ancient history.
Okay.
And then I teach AP European history, and I teach electives to seniors.
Well, Ralph,
So it's history.
I'm a classicist myself and taught ancient history back in the day. But the one of the things that we found most striking in our data, it's one of the very few actual differences we saw between public and private schools, was that in private schools, social studies is high and to the right. It's where, Carmen, you were suggesting it ought to be. And that in public schools, we saw it really in a lower level of challenge, and also lower level of love it. And our hypothesis about it, and I think it makes some sense, is there's no high stakes standardized testing in most states for social studies. And so in public schools, it gets underdone because it doesn't lead, it's not important in that way that high stakes testing makes things important, whereas in the vast majority of private schools, they're not subject to any of those tests. So the social studies allows itself to be what it really can and should be, and I'm sure is in Ralph Marshall's class. Rinda?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do private schools use the head football coach to teach history?
Sometimes.
They use the soccer coach.
Yeah. No, I'm just remembering that it kind of works. It kind of works a different way than it might in Arkansas.
I was gonna say, generally in public schools here, it's
you hire a football coach and then find something for them to do in the classroom. Private schools kind of work the other way. You hire an English teacher and then figure out what he can coach. So yeah. So it sounds to me like we buy this premise that some level of disruption can be really positive, and then we start to look at the ways to disrupt. And Ralph, I agree with you that technology is one of those ways, but only one. And as Clay Christensen wrote, in most schools is far less disruptive than it could be. Does this list of ways to disrupt seem complete? Are there other ways in which one might disrupt? And when I think about EAST, I think about that as a content and pedagogy disruptor.
Yes, EAST is very much a content and pedagogy disruptor. I will say, having worked with multiple schools over the last 6 years, schedule almost seems to be more of a disruptor from what I've seen as an outside observer. Schedule almost seems to be more of a disruptor for the faculty than the students. In how do I make an adjustment, because we've gone from a traditional scheduling to all of a sudden we're 4x4 block this year, to the next year we're doing the
hybrid,
new tech, the hybrid, you're going to go here and there, whatever. For some students, it can be very successful, and for others not. But it almost seems more of a faculty disruptor than.
Right. And does faculty generally have input into changes in schedules?
Rarely, in my case, that I've seen.
Ours has from time to time, but not on a very day-to-day basis, but on the larger questions, they do come to the faculty. Yeah.
Okay.
They'll ask us, what would you like to teach next year? And then there'll be opportunities for that. But then it's all about student load. If only 5 kids sign up, that class doesn't make. So they got to look at, using their resources. But for the most part, I come in the next year going, what do I teach? I find that before school starts, literally a day before
But
school
teachers
starts.
aren't generally part of a conversation about going 4x4 block or,
No,
all right, okay.
they'll ask. That's that fourth quadrant you went over earlier. They,
Unheard and
Yeah.
unvalued, okay,
yeah,
which we called invisible.
invisible, right?
Right. So of these ways to disrupt, COVID taught us that some are more potent than others, some are more useful than others, or no?
Can I just add one more? I think that maybe doesn't quite fit into any of them.
Sure, Ralph, please
particularly.
do. Yeah.
Role reversal, I think, is sometimes helpful, where the authority of the teacher is put on the side, and the natural hierarchy that's always there,
Yeah.
even though that we do our best to avoid making it, apparent, is directly addressed and reversed. And
Well, Ralph,
useful, especially during this period, because it gave agency to students who really didn't.
you're breaking up. Are other people having a little trouble hearing what,
Please
Ralph,
go.
you're breaking up just a little bit there. And I think what I heard you say was that giving students a kind of agency. Is that?
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I found that role reversal can give students some agency. And am I still breaking up?
No, you're much better now. Yeah.
Am I still breaking?
No, you're
better?
good.
Okay.
You're good. You're good.
All right.
Yeah.
So yes, that's basically okay. So that's basically what I was saying. I don't want to take any more time, but role reversal I think is useful. So.
And you may be interested in Stan's session in our third piece, in which he's really talking about putting engagement in the hands of the students to figure out. So I think you might find that really interesting. All right, we have 48 seconds and before we are going to go back to our main room. And I would ask that I not have to say anything in the recap except for you folks are going to say a thing. So if there was something that you pulled out that was of interest in this conversation, if you'd be willing just to pipe right up and when our time comes and tell the group a thing that you pulled from this conversation. Would you give me a thumbs up if that's okay with you? Are we good on that? I see Stan is the only one who's given me a thumbs up. So, oh, I got 2 thumbs up, but not from Carmen or Rinda. Carmen and Rinda, can you find a thing? Okay, Carmen, it's to you. You're nodding. Okay. Well, we are headed back in 3, 2, 1.
Muted, Rob.
Yes, I think we actually recorded our session, so I'm very pleased about that. And we want to take a few minutes to do a recap. Brendan, who's going first?
I think we got to stay consistent. I think you got to go first.
Okay, well, my group notes that I'm going to say nothing except for each of them would say a thing. So in whatever order, we were discussing the positives of disruption, that COVID has taught us that tedium is not necessarily a student engagement raiser.
So we discussed quite a bit in here, but I really like the takeaway that Ralph offered right there at the end. Student agency can be one of the best that there is in letting them have the power of inquiry and leadership. So Ralph loved, that was music to my ears, loved it.
One of the things I took away from it was, disruptions happen. It's how we can overcome those problems, those issues to make it more successful for students, for faculty, for everyone.
And then also talking about, as
Carmen, we can't hear you.
Yeah, that's really strange. You're
muted.
not on mute. Oh, there you are.
Now you're on mute.
This is very confusing.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Now
Okay.
we can.
Okay. We're talking about how as students get older, that school becomes more monotonous. When they're younger,
I'm going to fill in for the moment and say that Carmen works with younger students. And so one of the questions we were asking of Carmen was, does she see that same kind of monotony
yes.
happening through, okay, you're back. I'm sorry. I was just trying to fill in there while we lost you.
I don't know what, this is why I didn't want to talk. So as students get older, the school becomes monotonous. Younger students don't feel that as much as older students. And so when you have that disruption, whether it's in schedule or technology, like we saw in COVID, where kids are learning from home, then your engagement goes up because now those older students are, it's not the same anymore, it's different.
And I think I would just add that part of what made Fortitium was the kind of pedagogy that is used in order to get students ready for high stakes testing.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
I guess I can add to that, that we also mentioned that this disruption that happened and none of us planned on it taught us the limits and the opportunities that technology offers. And when we talk about disruption, it should be a very broad understanding of what can break up any petrified approach to teaching. And it is, technology is one of many and can be employed, to sort of enhance those many other approaches to disruption. So I think that was the conversation was one that included many different elements, and technology was just happened to be one of them because it became so important during this particular natural disruption we've all experienced. So.
Thank you, Ralph. And Brendan, I think that concludes our message, I think.
All right. Well, I'm going to follow your lead and invite the members of my group to share out a little bit. Just as you all were reflecting, it occurred to me that there's a really nice dovetailing between these two topics, because giving students more autonomy in their learning is a really good way to introduce disruption. In fact, much of our discussion centered around, some of the obstacles to implementing a scope and sequence for autonomy is that as kids get older and into the high school years, when there is a lot more pressure on the content and college admissions and making sure that they know certain things and have mastered certain skills, that the sort of chaos of creating these more play-like, project-based, performance-based experiences for them involves a lot of kind of messy chaos in the middle that can make a lot of instructors really, really nervous, because it's hard to know, is this working? Are they doing the thing? So our sort of exit ticket in our conversation was, what's one thing you think your school could do tomorrow to more intentionally guide students towards autonomy in their learning? So if folks want to share those out, or anything else that was a takeaway from our conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, Peter had touched on this notion of, in schools with younger students, having opportunities to try to bridge the gap between academic learning and like recess or playtime. And I thought that was a really interesting idea that, we could have used a lot more time to develop. But I think it's interesting, how could you do that, and how could you help get the autonomy that you find in students just playing or having recess or whatever that might be into an academic teaching setting? How would you bridge that? I think it's an interesting idea I'll be thinking about for a while.
All right. Any other thoughts from the autonomy group? All right. Well, we know we recorded it because we had Brendan in our group.
And I think we actually recorded ours too, but I'm not sure how it happened. Because I heard the thing say your session is being recorded, but I hadn't pushed the button. Maybe Stan had or someone else had. Well,
Who knows?
I think we've recorded it. In any case, Gwyneth, thank you so much for participating in with us and leading that group.